putting yourself together. And just a little history on me is that I used to event back in the day, so I am familiar. And I also have been an avid endurance rider since I was in vet school in 1981 when I started. So I will apply a lot of these same techniques to eventing that you use for almost any aerobic type of discipline, which includes endurance or any kind of sport that requires not a sprint or a gallop kind of speed. But with eventing, sometimes that's what we do. So I want to know, to start, who here has used a heart rate monitor? Good. So there will be a take-home message here, and I'm going to try to drive this into the ground a little bit, that one of the best ways that you can help to train your horse is to invest in one of these tools. So let's just go. If you're interested in more information, I have 2 books. Both have a ton of information on conditioning. This one here, Go the Distance, is all about that. So it doesn't matter that it's for endurance horses, it will apply to adventures too. So we all know that horses really weren't evolved to be ridden, but they go back in time. And in the United States, we have here at the Rock Art, you can see these little riders on top of their paintings, painted horses. But the thing that's important is that they were out there hunting and used the horses for transportation. And what we're doing today is so physiologically demanding that we have to think of this differently in terms of how we generate the best performance out of these horses with the most safety and welfare for them. Obviously, we need to have the horse fit for the task, and I think this is one of the things that people really forget. They think that just because the horse is out pasture for, on 40 acres, that's enough to make that horse fit, and it's not. And so if you're going to jump, they need to train for that, and if you're going to do combined driving, that's what you need to train for. But just keep that in mind, that you really want these horses to be skilled at what your demands are. And it's a beautiful thing with the eventing. We have so many different types of disciplines combined, and you get to kind of tap into everything. So how are you going to develop the best athlete? You're going to take, this is obviously not your prime event candidate, but you're going to take a flaccid-looking animal and turn them into a fit and tone animal. So it's no secret to any of us, especially in the veterinary world, when we come on your property and look at your horses, I can tell whether you've been doing your homework. And you may think your horse is fit, but you really want them to be strong and robust. And these are obviously, I've got a lot of endurance horse slides, but you will get the idea here. So as I said, you can't just turn them out to the pasture and expect them to be super fit. One of my horses lived on a 460-acre ranch and turned out in the mountains, in the foothills up above Lyons. And he stayed home, but that was not enough to be able to do the sport that I wanted to do. Obviously, want to develop fitness according to what you're going to do. How long will you be riding that horse? For a 50 or 100-mile endurance ride, you're going to have to develop that horse differently than if you're going to go into a 3 or 4 minute dressage test with a short period of show jumping, but a longer period of confined, of eventual offenses. How far are you going to have to ride? What speed? And this is the thing that people forget, is that if you only have access to a flat area and you don't train these horses to hill work, and then you take them to a competition with hills, they're going to get fatigued. And then again, soft type of footing is all you know, then the horse is prone to cruising, and if the terrain is firm, then they get into deep footing and they end up with tendon or ligament injuries. So they have to be able to carry a load. That means you and your tack. And the difficulty, and I'm just giving this little preliminary background because some of these things are so obvious that people don't even think about them. And you are obviously not going to be eventing in this kind of terrain, but this is the sort of thing that if you are going to go train these horses, you might want to avail yourself of the conditions that we have around Colorado, which are incredible. We have so many places that these horses can get super good training, as I'm going to talk about, without putting out a lot of effort into the musculoskeletal system, but they will train their cardiovascular system by doing hill work. And then the speed that you're going to be riding. And if you're at novice level, that's going to be a lot different than intermediate or advanced. So who here does a lot of cross training? Meaning everything out of the arena in addition to your regular work and skill set. Good. So here's an example of a horse that is untrained and very young. And with training, this developed into that. And I'll thank Lori Kendall for those pictures. She's been an avid eventer in her past. Then you want to make sure that you have good saddle and tack fit. Obviously, this is not going to work for a horse with those white spots. That horse is being bruised repeatedly under the saddle at the withers. There's one of my young horses with a cast of a mold where I had a custom saddle made, and it makes all the difference. And you want to make sure that saddle fits both you and the horse, and then you will be able to ride better, and that horse will become less fatigued. Conditioning is a process that takes years to develop to peak, and you need to progressively load these guys. And I would urge everybody to use a training log. Who here has been using a training? Good. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or sophisticated. One of these took this one in the bottom off of a board in Italy where they had a bunch of horses training, and here's another one, just a friend. She'd write in her notes. But keep track of things, how that horse is feeling, what the conditions of the day are, how fast you went, the duration. And that way, if something develops and crops up and you have a problem, you can look back and see where maybe it was starting a certain time and you weren't aware of it, but then it becomes obvious that the problem was beginning at such and such a time. And that will help you unveil some subtle things that could become worse and significant, and you could attack them very quickly and get them all straightened out before the horse has a real problem. So the success of an athlete depends on musculoskeletal soundness and metabolic efficiency in these sports. You absolutely rely on the metabolic component to be able to help this horse through all their exercises over fences and in the dressage ring. And that way they don't get tired, and then if they're not tired and fatigued, then the musculoskeletal system isn't taxed as hard as it could be. So you need the good genetic potential, excellent management, and strategic conditioning. So what are our goals? We're trying to improve the respiratory system to increase oxygen uptake because we want to work as much as possible in the aerobic range of metabolism, which means that energy is converted in the presence of oxygen to drive locomotion. Excuse me, food substrates are converted to energy. And we want these horses to be able to exercise with as little ventilation effort as possible. The cardiovascular system, we're trying to get these horses to work harder at a lower heart rate. This is where the heart rate monitor will come in a minute. I'll talk about that. Their heart rate, their heart size and strength will increase. They will develop more blood supply to the entire system, so there's less resistance in the blood vessels. This is no different than what happens with us when we're training. And the red blood cell volume will increase, and that increases oxygen carrying capacity, which improves the metabolism and the oxygen range. And then there's a thing here, but thermoregulation is important so that they can get rid of their internal heat, because about 80% of the heat that they use to move them through a field or any kind of activity is going to be converted to heat from the muscles. In muscles, you want to improve the aerobic capacity, and by improving the ability of this certain kind of muscle fibers to work better and more efficiently before they start to develop lactic acid in the muscles, which accumulates and causes fatigue. It will actually develop, as you can see. Muscles to use and so you can see muscles get fit really quickly within maybe 4 to 6 months, and ligaments and tendons will take 12 months anyway. And then bones take about 2 years to develop. So if you're starting a young horse, you really want to go very methodically through this process. And if you're taking an older horse from a different career, similarly, you'll want to develop them. It's very confusing to some people because they look at their horse that's muscularly developed and cardiovascular system is good, but they don't have yet the strength and elasticity and resilience in their tendons and ligaments, and that's when they get into trouble and have injuries. So in an inadequate base on these horses, you end up with all kinds of injuries, anything from tendons, ligaments, to a sacroiliac injury, to a fibrotic myopathy, tear of the back muscle of the leg. So the premise of what we like to see happen with an event horse particularly is a long, slow distance philosophy. That's where you're going to very methodically build this horse up. And you're going to improve the aerobic capacity, which is the ability of those muscles to use energy in the presence of oxygen to generate energy, and ATP, which is energy currency that drives locomotion. And you want to improve that over time. And so you're going to mildly stress these structures, and this takes 3 to 12 months at any rate. And you don't want to push the horse too fast too soon. And again, that's what happens a lot of times, is what my experience has been with clients over the years, is that the horse looks fantastic, feels fantastic, and then they just start jumping and doing more speed work, and then the horse gets into trouble with some injury, and then there's a long layup, and then they get to start all over again. So we want to avoid that. So let's say you were starting from the beginning or starting a young horse, you want to start with slow mileage, maybe trot for an hour or 4 to 6 miles every other day after you've laid this horse up. And then you increase incrementally the distance or speed, but never both at the same time. So if you're increasing the distance, then you're going to back down on the speed. And similarly, if you increase the speed, you'll back down on the distance. And then later you can start to combine them two into more and more effort. So working trot, you're not going to probably want to ride like these guys on the right, where they're strung out endurance horses. That's actually me up in Montana. But you want, that's at 50 miles. So you want these horses to be really resilient, to be able to do their job and come out of it and feel really good at the end of it. You're probably going to want to ride more like that, where you're a little more collected and engaging the hindquarters and the abdominal muscles and the whole core. But you still want to get a good working trot. These horses won't really develop well if you just kind of putz around out there and don't have a good drive. So warming up is important. You want to increase circulation of blood flow in the tissues. Same for us. None of this is very different. The temperature of the tissues improves for efficient enzyme and biochemical reactions. The range of motion of the joints improves as you warm the horse up, as well as the improvement in the muscle tendons and ligaments and elasticity to withstand the stress of work. And I didn't mean to gross you out, but I think it's really interesting. This is the heart. This is an old partner of mine. He's about 6 foot, so you can see the size of his hand. He had a big hand. That is the core of what we're trying to develop. It's that heart muscle to do good work and to provide good blood flow to all the muscles in the entire system. And that pump is going to deliver oxygen to the tissues and the circulatory removal of all the other waste products like heat from the working muscles and the lactic acid that develops. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. We also are going to improve the red blood cell and oxygen transport so that there's more red blood cells in the circulation. The spleen is a big storage capacity for more red blood cells. So when the horse needs it in time of hard work, that can be released. And then hemoglobin, which helps carry oxygen to the tissues, is improved. The heart muscle actually will enlarge. The capillary beds will develop in the skeletal muscle, and the heart improves to improve oxygen delivery. And the skin circulation improves for better sweating to get rid of that heat out of the system, of the core. And this is particularly important when you're riding in hot weather, especially if you're riding in hot weather where it's humid. You also get increased circulation in the skeletal muscle fibers and in the muscle cells. The mitochondria is a little engine factory that develops energy, and so you'll get more mitochondrial. It's a whole biochemical process that happens within the cells, and that will improve and expand. And then you'll improve the enzymes for oxidative metabolism, which is, again, aerobic work. This is a graphic, very, almost cartoonish, but it shows you what unconditioned capillaries and muscle fibers will look like. And then if you have several months of steady aerobic conditioning, you will actually see development of those blood vessels and capillaries. This is hard to see in this light, but this is a horse. It's a thin-skinned thoroughbred, but you can see all these little capillaries sticking out on that horse. It's actually a pretty fit horse, and if you look at any pictures of race horses, you will see that too. And if you start to develop your own horse, you will start to see that when they shed out their winter coat. Then you're going to see better evaporative cooling and sweating. When you see this kind of foamy material, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that just is proteins in the skin cells that come out when the horse has not been regularly worked or at the beginning of their conditioning program. You don't tend to see that kind of foamy sweat when the horse is fit. And so that's another measure, something you can look at and see if that's going to start to become more watery and dilute over time. So heart rate, this is where it all hinges for what you can do, because Erin asked me to provide you with some information of ways that you can measure fitness. And so I'm going to go a little bit into this, and I borrowed some graphic material from Dr. Chris Pollard over in Australia, because it really shows well what we're trying to achieve. So it's sort of obvious that if you are going faster, then oxygen needs to be delivered to the tissues better. So where you have hill work, your heart rate's going to climb, but the speed's going to be less. And similarly for sand and mud, it's going to be in between and flat and go faster. Heart rate monitor, this is not the best slide because it doesn't show it properly. This little electrode pad would go under here, and then another electrode pad goes on the other side of the horse at the girth. And then we wear a wristband that will read about 3 feet away from the horse. And the beauty of this is that heart rate monitor is catching things as that horse is working. Oops, sorry. That's catching things as the horse is working. There may be a 6-second delay, depends on the program that you have in your heart rate monitor. But the bottom line is that you can see exactly what that horse is doing while you're riding. So we want the accuracy of the working heart rate, not the one where we jump off and start counting for 15 seconds. And this allows you to measure exactly where you're at so that you can actually drive that horse through a certain heart rate, which will help you with your conditioning. If you jump off and count for 15 seconds, that heart rate will have dropped by half by the time that you get it measured. And what you want, ideally, to be the long, slow distance and the aerobic level is to have these heart rates working under 130 to 150, depends on the horse and the terrain. And then we're going to talk about what happens when you drive that heart rate up higher and bump it over 160 to 170 beats per minute. So the onboard heart rate monitor gives you the working heart rate. It also allows you to do a heart rate recovery, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It also can help you establish whether the horse is experiencing pain. And I will give you a scenario that happened to a good friend, actually a vet colleague of mine who we went to school together. And she was down in Texas and took her horse over to ride over by Corpus Christi. And she said that her horse's heart rate was out of control high that day. And she couldn't understand it. She thought she could do it with her electrodes, and she tried this and that. And they rode for 3 hours and did a great training ride. She's a big-time endurance rider. And she got in the trailer to go home, and this horse collapsed with a horrible colic. Now, could she have predicted that? Maybe, maybe not. But the thing was, that horse was telling her that there was something wrong. And you don't always know this, but the heart rate monitor can actually pick up pain and also an impending, obviously, metabolic problem. Sometimes toxic metabolites from damaged muscle will start to cause some kind of reaction, and the heart rate will drive up. So, skipping ahead here, and I will come back to the heart rate in a minute. Part of your cardiovascular conditioning phase is strength training. And you can actually, more than half of injuries are preventable with appropriate strength training. And muscle strength will increase 50 to 100% in 6 months. And this applies to people too, by the way. So, if you want to climb Long's Peak, you're not going to just start out on Long's Peak. You're going to develop yourself over the course of different trails and build up to that. And as you get stronger and stronger, it will be less effort for you, and the same with the horses. You want to increase the number of repetitions so that you also increase resistance. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. But you can achieve this with hill work. And we're so lucky here in Colorado and in the mountain region that we have hills to work on. And you can use those hills to drive the heart rate up without taxing the musculoskeletal system, which is really a huge deal. Because if you want longevity in these horses, the last thing we're going to do is use up the legs. And then the value of cross-training is essential. So get out of the arena and start to use some of what we've got around here, and you will have a great time. And not only that, your horse's mental focus will be so different. They get out and they see the big spaces and they go, wow, this is really cool. I'm not in an arena going repetitively around and around. So this is comparable to human weightlifting. You put a rider on a horse's back with some tack, and then you trot the canter up these hills, and you get all kinds of developments in the muscles and the cardiovascular system. You want them to push with their haunches and not pull with their front legs. So that's another training technique to try to engage the hind end and the core. So walking up gets the cardiovascular system exercised. You go a little faster, you get the muscles and the cardiovascular system, and then in a canter, they start to develop the skill set of good neurologic function and synchrony of the rear legs. Downhill, I love these two pictures because here you got this fantastic horse that's just right under himself, and this one on the other side of the screen, the chestnut, is kind of creeping down the hill, and you can see the difference. So you can maximize these horses' neurologic capabilities so that when you start to negotiate jumps, that they have a better feel for what they're doing. And then, at some point you can trot down these hills too, within reason, and once your horse is legged up well and able to handle that. And here's, as I said, I have a lot of endurance slides. This is a 100-mile race in Montana, and these guys are happily cruising along down the mountain, and they are fit to do that. So a couple definitions. Aerobic endurance, as I explained a little earlier, is that the metabolism is going to be in the presence of oxygen, and it's a low to moderate, what we call submaximal type of work. And so that's something that we as riders in our type of riding pursuits are going to maximize for our horses. But we also want to push them to an anaerobic threshold, and that's a point at which they start to convert to an anaerobic metabolism system that then generates some lactic acid. And I'm going to show you that in a graph here in a minute. And then the aerobic capacity is the intensity of exercise that horse can perform before bumping into the anaerobic threshold. For a beginning horse, that might be 130 beats per minute. For an older, more developed horse, that might be 150. So you will have ways to gauge your horse's development with your heart rate monitor. And also, you can feed them appropriately. If you use dietary fats and a lot of forage, that is a great source of nutrients to drive aerobic metabolism, instead of these grain type of meals that cause all kinds of problems between gastric ulcers and gastric colic and everything else, laminitis in the worst case. And so if you work with your veterinarian and talk to them about how to feed your horse to be a safer food, but still provide calories to keep the weight on your horse, that's a good idea. So this is complicated. This is this is the essence of what drives energy. And so what I want to just point out here is that when the horses are working anaerobically and they're going over a threshold where they can no longer function in the presence of oxygen, the muscles need to drive into different energy sources. When that happens, they'll generate 2 ATPs, which are energy molecules, and lactic acid. But if they're in the aerobic range, they get 36 ATPs, that same type of work, and generate water and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide goes out through the lungs, the water goes out through the kidneys and into the intestinal tract. And so this is ideal to try to stay within the aerobic plane. And sometimes when you're jumping, you're not going to be able to do that, or galloping. Lactic acid has a lot of fatiguing effects. It decreases the muscle pH, and then the efficiency of muscle contraction is limited, and energy production in the muscle is reduced. So you don't really want these horses to drive in the anaerobic range for very long if possible. So here's some more of these kind of give you an idea here. You've got a horse is exercising and then it stops exercising. You see the heart rate goes down, but the lactic acid doesn't go down quite as quickly as the heart rate. So depending, this is the heart rate working up at 200, 220. It's pretty high. And it's hard to get some of these horses up that high, nor would you probably want to, but it is possible at a higher level of eventing. So reaching that anaerobic threshold and bumping that horse into it periodically will improve the resistance of the accumulation of lactic acid. And since lactic acid is a limiting factor to the endurance of that horse, and they'll develop fatigue from it, you want to maximize the horse's ability to work as long as possible in the aerobic range. And even though 80 to 90% of your ride is going to be aerobic work, anaerobic work will occur if you're in difficult terrain, deep footing, hill climbs, increased speed, or jumping efforts. So, here's Telegraph Hill down there at the Air Force Base, and if you're racing or if you're really going after it in an event, you're going to be pushing that horse right up against that threshold. So you can train them for that, and it's called fartleks. It's a kind of a speed play. It's like a little sprint, a very brief sprint, and that gets that horse bumping into that anaerobic threshold. And once again, in order to accomplish this, you need your heart rate monitor, and that will really help you figure out where that horse is. So once they're a lot fitter, then they're able to metabolize some of that lactate and turn it back into less noxious materials in their body. If you were to work a horse anaerobically without stop, the maximum they could probably do is about 4 minutes. And race horses only run for 2 minutes, basically. People who chase horses, I'm not sure quite what they're doing because I don't know enough about them, but they run a pretty hard course, and it's usually over in less than 4 minutes. So interval training is taking that fartlek concept and expanding it. So after you've got this long, slow distance base, after first season, you want to start doing a little bit more high intensity work of limited duration so that you minimize the structural damage to the musculoskeletal tissues. Horses to go from 170 to 200 beats per minute for at least 2 to 3 minutes duration. And you're not going to know that without a heart rate monitor. And I found some places up in the mountains that I could actually sprint up these hills, steep hills, and it was hard for me to get my horse to 190 or above. So they're all metabolically a little different, but you can find the terrain around you to do this, and it's really fantastic. You're going to show up at these events, and the horse is going to go, oh, this is a walk in the park, because they're so fit. So when you do that, with the interval training, the whole idea is that it's intervals. So you have rest periods in between. So with the aerobic work, your rest period will be the same or twice as long as what you were working at. So, and probably that's not going to really help you with interval training. But let's take an example. If you're working for 5 minutes of working trot, then you go 5 to 10 minutes of slower pace. But the big one is the anaerobic work and rest. So if you gallop your horse for 2 minutes, you want to give them a 10 to 12 minutes of a slower pace, which could be a good, strong working trot. Again, your heart rate monitor is going to help tell you where you are. You want to be under 150 beats per minute during that rest period. And if you do this once or twice a week, over time, your horse is going to be developing more and more condition and be able to handle the work more easily. So just different speeds. Heart rate's related to speed, obviously. It's no secret. So the faster you go, walk, trot, canter, you're going to have a higher heart rate. This is fun because you can see with interval training, you're going up the hill 3 times, 1, 2, 3, 4 actually. And then there's a rest period here. And then here's showing you the recovery as you come down that hill. The horse is over 200 beats per minute. And then as you trot downhill, comes down and recovers. And recovery is everything. Steep, deep, you can use these kind of conditions to help train your horse. Here's a horse that's carrying 132 pounds over 9 miles per hour. And here's one going 12 miles per hour, carrying the same amount of weight at the same track. And what's interesting is how they recover. And they all are, this one's recovered to 40, and that's 46. But this one got to, well over the anaerobic range. So it's just an interesting comparison. Different horses and different speeds, but the same everything else. Downhill is where you really get some improvements, and especially if you're out there galloping, at Abbey Ranch or any of the other eventing areas, they have some hill work and you can train for that. And then different efforts and different sports, but we're only going to be involved with the eventing. So the heart rate is obviously related to weight, so you have to consider not just you, but all your equipment. Ponying reduces the work effort by about 30%, so that you can use that as a training tool to help leg up a horse. And initially, you can use a ponying effort so that they're not quite as compromised, and then start adding weight. And then if the rider is less than 20% of the weight of the horse, that's ideal with the tack combined. This is a big guy on a little Arab, but you know what? That's a training tool, because if you got a smaller horse and a bigger person, then that horse can get fitter at home at training and then go out and do a job with a smaller person on their back, and it'll be a lot easier. And then this just shows solid line here is 26% of body weight with the guy who's 220 pounds, and dotted line is 13% of the horse's body weight with a 132-pound rider. And look at the difference in heart rates. So that can be used as a training tool to help condition your horse. And it's also something you should be cognizant of. When you have a little horse and a big rider, they're going to have to make a lot harder effort. Heat and humidity will make all the difference with sweat and dehydration, and the more water they lose out of their system and the more salts they lose out of their system, the more fatigued they will become. And here's an example that a normal horse might be working at 140 beats per minute, and as the horse dehydrates, that heart rate, same horse, same everything, will be 160 beats per minute. And with severe dehydration, that heart rate will be up 190. And again, your heart rate monitor can help you track that. So aerobic recovery periods are important to flush the lactic acid and heat from the muscles, restore the oxygen circulation in the tissues, and restore the energy systems that are based on oxygen. Cooling them down is important to slowly reduce the exercise intensity and redistribute blood flow away from the skeletal muscles to the internal organs, and then disperse heat and lactic acid from the muscles. And it also releases the muscle tension and minimizes soreness in the following days. So aerobic muscle metabolism, as we said, it delays fatigue and will fit the horse less exertion. So that applies to all of us as mammals. If you are fit, then you can gallop further and faster than a horse that's not quite as conditioned. And even though the fit horse may work at a higher heart rate because they're going a little faster, the lactic acid and the heart rate will decline more quickly than they do for an unfit horse. And this is one of the tenets that we use in the endurance world and in the eventing world, is heart recoveries. So here is, initially you've got fit horses, the dotted line, and the unfit horses, the solid line. And then after year training, they're comparable, and they have essentially the same heart rates, only they're going a little bit harder and bumping up into that anaerobic threshold over 150 or 160 beats per minute. Then here's a horse that's fit with a 220-pound rider over 50 miles. Everything looks pretty much the same, except this guy's taken an extra hour and a half. The novice horse is exhausted. He takes longer, and his heart rate recovery is much slower, much slower. You can see this one drops quickly, and this one does not. So what we want to see is at rest stops, let's say you're training your horse and you want to measure his heart rate with your heart rate monitor, you want to see them drop back down to 60, 64 beats per minute within just a few minutes, ideally, and within 10 minutes for sure. And if they're not falling down to that level, then they're being overtaxed for what they're able to do, or to the weather conditions of the day, or the terrain. If its pulse criteria is greater than 5 to 10 minutes, then you start looking for a problem. Is it musculoskeletal with pain, or metabolic with dehydration or electrolyte derangements? Is the horse being ridden too fast for their level of fitness, the terrain, or the climate? So you can oversee what you're doing with your horse, and you can start to take measurements. And if you keep training log, you can log this all into your record, and then you can look back and see how this horse is improving. Slow down recovery by head down eating and need to urinate. So keep that in mind as you're measuring this. And certainly a heat load and dehydration is going to slow down the heart rate recovery because there's not as much circulating blood volume to drive everything through the system. Cardiac recovery index is a really important thing, and it's a couple of endurance vets, colleagues of mine, developed this years ago, and back before the Atlanta Olympics, Ken Allen came out to the Old Dominion endurance race, 100 miles in Virginia, and we taught him how to do this so that it got used in the Atlanta Olympics. And basically, you start with the horse with the baseline heart rate, and you ask that horse to trot out 125 feet out, 125 feet back. You start your stopwatch, and in exactly 1 minute, you'll remeasure the heart rate. You want it to come to the same point, either 60 beats per minute, and then it repeats at 60 beats per minute, and then if it goes 60, 64, that's okay. But if it's 60, 68, there may be a problem. If it's 60, 56, that's fantastic. And you can do this. You can just do this in your own backyard. You can go out on the trails and do your little bit of cross training on the trails, work your horse, and then measure this. You can even stay mounted if you wanted to because you've got your heart rate. But while you're trotting the horse out, we get to see heart rate recovery. We see how sound they are, what their impulsion is, and if there's any musculoskeletal pain. And that corroborates all the other physical findings that I'm going to show you in a minute. But you want it to be within 10% of the resting range. Does that make sense to everybody? It's a great tool, and it can reveal pain, toxic metabolites, colic, or exhaustion. This horse here, and I'm using some endurance examples, but it gives you an idea. This horse at 20 miles looked perfectly fine with all the vet exam and everything, except his cardiac recovery index was really abnormal. And within 10 minutes, he developed this kind of a muscular cramp, a tied up situation, and needed IV fluids for about 6 hours. But that can tell you a lot. So just one parameter has a wealth of information for you, and you guys can do this all by yourselves at home. Other metabolic parameters, and this could be an entire talk to you, but just to run through them, you need to learn how to evaluate these. These are really important. You want to look at mucous membrane color and refill time. It should look like the color under your pinky. And if you push on that, it should come back within a couple of seconds. The skin tenting, the best place to check that is the point of the shoulder. And I will let you know that if you have its skin stays up a little bit, that horse is probably already 3 to 5% dehydrated. That said, horses with thin skin or old horses, you may see some skin tenting. Another good place to check is right on the upper eyelid. You can squeeze that if they'll let you. And you don't want to see. Even just traveling to an event will cause these horses to be dehydrated as much as 3 to 5%. Jugular refill time, you hold off the jugular vein and see how fast that refills. Some horses with very low heart rates and very fit horses will have a very slow jugular refill time. But learn what's normal for your horse. Gastrointestinal sounds and motility, learn how to listen to all the quadrants and both flanks, 2 on each side, and listen to sounds. And you know how your stomach sounds when you're hungry and the rolling kind of motion that you hear, that's what you want to hear. And you should listen for a minute or two each area so that you get a feel for what's normal for your horse. Impulsion, we all know what that is. It's just the ability to move forward with a good strength and vigor. Feel the muscles on the back of the thighs. Do they feel flaccid, or do they feel like a rubber eraser? Or do they feel hard and firm, or does your horse resent you feeling those? Soundness is something you may need some help evaluating, but you know, if you've got a friend who can help you lunge the horse and you can watch from a distance, or videotape your horse so that you have a record over a period of time, that's a good thing. And then you can share that with your veterinarian, or have your veterinarian come out and do a soundness exam periodically so that you catch something early. Attitude and posture, these horses, they will be tired, they will be very deflated, if you will. And so watch your horse and see how they're doing each day. How are they in the pasture? Are they happy to be turned out? And appetite, a good appetite is important. So you want to avoid all the metabolic distress things. I want to just talk a little bit about overtraining versus overreaching. Overreaching is something that we would run into. Overtraining is probably more something a racehorse would run into. But there are hidden stressors in our horses' lives, and I think we forget as riders that the horse just goes out and does what we ask. And that's just the way it is because we're the boss person and we want them to do our sport. They don't really get a choice, right? So, but just think of this. If they're confined to a stall with no limited turnout, that is incredibly stressful, especially if they're not with their herd mates or have herd interaction, which is normal for a horse. And then if you just put them in the arena day after day and do the same thing over and over, they get bored and that is a stress. Some people can only feed twice a day, but that is also stress on the intestinal system. And they should have forage in front of them all the time, if possible. But some horses get fat, so you have to be careful or use grazing muzzles. Frequent transport to clinics and events that changes their routine, and that is stressful. Just as us getting on an airplane and flying somewhere changes our routine, and you're exposed to a lot of microbial invasion, and it can cause an illness too. Then when you ask them to do things that they're not capable of doing yet, and they're in the process of being trained to do that, keep in mind that some of this is overtaxing to them. So the horses that are overreached, that tend to be fatigued or poor performers, that usually can recover within 3 to 14 days with rest and support, whereas the racehorse type overtraining can take months to years to recover from that. And people forget, when you start to see your horses with less appetite, persistent weight loss, no matter what you feed, their heart rates are increasing as they work, their recoveries are poor, their performance deteriorates, they're lethargic, may or may not have diarrhea, they're grumpy, there are other behavioral changes, they refuse fences, they run out when they didn't used to, their posture's deflated, or they're not interested in the stimuli around them. This is a tip-off that maybe you're pushing too hard too fast. And if you follow kind of the good conditioning principles, you shouldn't run into those problems. And just, these thin type of horses. One important point that I found interesting in the literature was that gastric ulcers, there may be no difference in frequency or severity between horses overtrained and one that's not, but that can add it as a stressor to these horses if there is gastric ulcer disease. And there is knee cross-training. Questions? No?